Hi everyone. This week we're talking about the Rutledge Handbook, um, Chapter 9, End of Life, or Endings, I think they called it. I'm seeing now that I spelled this anthropology, so it's a new field of study that I'm entering in anthropology, and the end of life. This is Nako, the little boy, and his grandmother, Me Ma'arone, and we'll be talking a little bit about them during this short lecture. So first of all, let's just sort of back up to a broader sense, and you would have learned about some of this if you took the Intro Anthro course. But why is anthropology? I'm going to turn off this light. So I'm not getting. There we go. Why is anthropology sort of have a lot of study around death and dying? So first of all, because as they said in your chapter, because meanings of aging and being old are cultural as much as biological facts. So like the example of in Tanzania of what it means to be frail or how people are expected to be cared for, or the example um, uh, of, you know, people's practices around caring for bodies. Those are all cultural practices along with the biological reality of what death means. Um, a bunch of sort of important subsets of this is that there's often rites of passage or rituals that surround death and dying, and those have really rich, important cultural insights to share about a culture or society. And they're often rich with symbols, as all rituals or rites of passage are. They raise some of the big questions. I think the first sentence of your chapter said, death and birth are both wrapped in uncertainty and mystery. And so these are some of the big questions that philosophers and anthropologists and people who are interested in thinking about the human experience think about. They're unpredictable. There's this ideal time and place to die and way to die. But that's not always how things play out. And we'll talk a little bit about what good death looks like in a moment. And they're often linked with religious or spiritual beliefs, which of course, again, are rich with symbols, rich with important cultural insights. And then, as we read in the chapter, and as we've talked about in other units, there's uh, caring for the dead, and the dying is a moral endeavor, like care for the aging, care for bodies, care for ancestors. So, aging is another really interesting topic that my research in Ghana and in Lesotho deals with, and populations are changing, and it's changing how people are experiencing aging. Um, so, aging is a complex process that's highly variable, like the example in Tanzania. It makes evident. It's intersectional, so it's not just aging just doesn't happen to bodies in the same way across cultures, but it's intersectional with class, gender, ethnicity, culture, social organization, geography. And it's impacted by political, economic, and structural contexts like globalization, like urbanization, industrialization, distribution of disease. Obviously, the disease we're experiencing right now is demonstrating that in a real way. And then again, it's intertwined with care as a moral endeavor. So just some of the questions that were raised from the case studies that we read, and then we'll talk about them in the discussion board. So in the first one, becoming old and frail in Tanzania, the sort of questions that I think are interesting from that are what shaped people's experiences of frailty in Tanzania, and how do you see it as similar or different to the way we think about frailty in our society? I think these case studies do a really nice job of pushing us to think about what our values and understandings of old age are. How are they naturalized? Like, what do we think is naturally how you grow old and what it means to be old in our society versus understanding the cultural beliefs that shape our understanding of what that is in our society. And then the second one is about Alzheimer's in Brazil and how it sort of came to be recognized by people as an issue, and then the kind of discourses and practices around it as that occurred. And one thing I want to just call back to is in our chapter that we read about stress, we thought about this idea of the biolooping effect, and we talked about it in terms of things like chronic fatigue syndrome, but also anxiety and ADHD, and this idea of people, something gets named and then people recognize it in themselves, and so it starts to have this sort of feedback loop. So I'm curious if you think that's what happened in Brazil, is that people started to recognize that potentially what their loved ones had was Alzheimer's, and then it became increasingly a popular way to explain, cognitive decline in elderly people. And then what does Liebing mean when she says that increased diagnoses of Alzheimer's is making up people? I think that's a really important quote and interesting one. So we'll talk a little bit about that on the discussion board too, but thinking about like the creation of sort of to use a anthropology term, therapeutic citizens, or the creation of a category of patients that previously didn't exist. Um, and then the last one, which I really found fascinating, is caring for corpses in Singapore, and just thinking a little bit about why stigma persisted against those dealing with the dead in Singapore, and does our society have any similar stigmas? So the big question to start the week will be more general, and then the follow-up questions will be some of these questions that you might think about as you're reading or after you've read. So I just want to talk a little bit about some case studies. This idea of dying well was addressed in the introduction and the little in-between parts of your chapter by the editors. And people have these ideas about what it means to die, to have a good death. And so often people reflect on like maybe the way dying used to occur in the past, like in the good old days when a person got old, they were respected and they had their loved ones surrounding them and they weren't caring for orphans and that sort of thing. And maybe some of that is true, but there's also always the sort of idealized version of what should happen, and it often isn't the reality of how things are actually happening. But the HIV orphan problem in Lesotho has certainly made a good death unattainable, um, increasingly because people are having to care for children basically well into their old age or until they die. So in Ghana, a good death and a peaceful death occurs naturally. This is a quote from a man who's cited a lot in the chapter that you read, Vandergeest. It says, after a long and well spent life, after having solved arguments and conflicts in the company of dear ones without pain, while at peace with one's own death. So there's these ideas that people have about what it means to die well. And in Lesotho, the ideas are fairly similar to that and include, being cared for, being respected for your sort of wisdom and values, but not being expected to care for others or to do work. And in Lesotho, it's you would expect, given the high rate of orphaning, that people would make plans for, and the large number of grandmothers who are getting older and caring for young children, that they would make plans for what would happen to the children after they died, just like, my husband and I have a will for what will happen to our children if we were to both die at the same time. And that's much less likely than this grandmother pictured here, who in fact did die in 2013. And after she died, her granddaughter she was caring for got moved around to different places. Um, so, but people don't make plans, and that's just because there's so much uncertainty there that people can't predict who's going to be living, who's going to be migrated for work. So people normally figure it out basically at the funeral. Sorry. And then one of the trends is that there's this reversal of direction of care from the old to the young rather than from the young to the old. So in particular, in places with high rates of orphaning or migrant labor, this is the same dynamic that's occurring in Mexico, for example. There's been books about, parents going to work in the U.S. As migrant workers and leaving their kids behind with their mothers in Mexico or in other Central American countries, and so they're having to support grandchildren and care for them well beyond kind of what they were hoping or expecting. So I'm going to tell you about this little guy named Nako. He is HIV positive, and he spent the first 4 months of his life with his mother, and then his mother died. So then he went to the NGO that I work with for a little while, it's like half a year, and then he came back to live with his grandmother. Since 2010, he's lived with her, May Ma'aone. She's about 80 years old now, and she has chronic back pain and knee pain. A lot of times when I would go to visit her, I would bring like tubes of cream that I could get from the pharmacy to help with her pain, and painkillers and stuff like that. I'm not sure they help, but she always was asking me to bring them along. So, and then one day when I was visiting them, I was taking pictures of people to share with them. Like I would take their portraits and then bring them copies of them. And I told her I'd like to take a picture of you and Nako together so that I can print it for you and you can have a printed copy of the photograph. So instead of just like letting me take it, I didn't care what they were wearing, but she went in and like bathed him, and you can see he's like got Vaseline on his cheeks and put him in his like church outfit in this little adorable little furry coat and fancy pants and shoes. So this was his photographing. It was fairly common when I said I was going to photograph someone that they would put on something nicer because they wanted to look good in their photographs. So here he is. His grandmother is the one seated, Mema Arone, and then the one standing up behind him is his aunt. And this is in their outside their home where they live. Um, so this is another picture of him and his grandmother. Um, and, I was asking her if she ever talked to anyone about who would take care of Nako when she was no longer able to. And she said, yes, this is a quote. Yes, they had a conversation and there is no chance to give Nako to other people because it is me who's taking responsibility. Nako is my grandchild, so no one can take care of Nako except me. So that was, when the mother was sick, not when I was asking about her, sorry. And so, reflects this strong preference for care by kin. Um, and I asked May Maone about the challenges of caring for Nako, and she said the difficulty is with food because sometimes I used to give Nako only papa, which is maize meal. It's like a grain, but doesn't have any like protein or nutrients in it. Really, I mean, it has nutrients, but it's just like eating plain rice. And hodu, which is water from cooking vegetables. Those are the difficulties. Nako is waking up early and he's going up and down the village, so sometimes Nako is not taking his medication well. Those are the challenges. I have struggles. I actually have a memory of driving past that street, and I wasn't actually going to visit Mema Arone at that time, but I saw some kids. Kids used to run up alongside and was running beside my motorcycle, and they were saying, "Give me some sweets, give me some sweets." Kiko pati bombo is the Sisutu, because they just used to yell that at people, even if like they never got anything from it. They just kids would do that, and so then I stopped the thing because I recognized it as Nako. And once he realized it was me, he got really embarrassed and ran away, even though they're like running, chasing us. And once I stopped to talk to him and he saw that he knew me, he was like, "Oh, am I gonna get in trouble with my grandma?" Um, but so then I asked her about her father because his father lives up the hill from her, and if he ever helped. And she said, "Ach, the father is useless because, as you see, when I'm struggling, he doesn't care about it. I was asking him to find another woman to help me do Nako's washing and to bathe Nako, and he didn't say anything." So she does the primary care for Nako, like all the day-to-day feeding and clothing and stuff. The father did take Nako to the clinic every month for his medication. Um, and so, I found myself in this odd position of asking people about what would happen when they could no longer care for their loved ones. And so I asked her, when you can't care for him, who's going to care for him? And she said, I don't know. I'm asking myself about that all the time. And she said she was talking to her daughter, said, who will help me when I can't help this baby? She says, I don't know, but I will. The daughter is saying, I don't know who will be able to, but I'll help you. And later she said, I want the children to know their relatives. I don't know if my daughter will agree, but she'll agree when I'm dying. So in some ways, she had a very happy old age, but in other ways, her old age was shaped by AIDS mortality and AIDS care, by gendered ideas about who should provide the daily care, an able-bodied man in his 50s rather than this 70 80-year-old woman, by migrant labor and who's available at the time based on that, by poverty, by her own bodily frailty, lack of access to treatment and pain relief or palliative care, and also by cultural ideas about aging. So I just wanted to share that case study with you to kind of like show you the complexities of um, aging and death and dying, and caring for loved ones. So, yeah, so I'm looking forward to talking online and on next Thursday with you all about this stuff. I hope you have a great week.